woman everybody loves. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. And today we're going to talk about P5.js. Just going to have a little bit of fun with it. But we're going to talk about P5.js a little bit. What is it? What does it do? What is it built on? Then we'll do some examples with it. The lab for this module is relatively simple, right? You're just basic requirements. It's got to move. It's got to be interactive, right? And so we're going to kind of do some things that are based on that. When we get to the demonstration portion of what I want to be doing today. But P5.js is, in my opinion, fairly simple, right? When I am doing new things with programming with kids, I use P5.js. Right, I think it's a good introduction to programming. It is a library or framework, and I think it's a good one. Right, it uses the Canvas API in JavaScript, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Or I guess it's probably in HTML. Canvas API in HTML. That we'll talk about in a little bit. And so this also helps us to satisfy some of the requirements of our course description, because the course description talks about using libraries and frameworks. And so when we get acquainted with using libraries and frameworks, I like for us to use an easy one to get us acquainted with it, and P5.js is one of them. It's a good one to kind of cut our teeth with, just kind of using an easy JavaScript library. It's also a good one to kind of help us learn how to utilize documentation. Right, because one of the big things out of this entire program that I want you all to kind of gather is that it's kind of impossible for me to teach you all everything in the course of a couple years. So when you get into the real world, there might come a time where you have to learn something on your own or pick up something else on your own. So being able to learn how to utilize documentation or other resources to kind of be able to take what you know and expand upon it into new areas is super important. So I believe, some of the ancillary skills that we kind of pick up in this module are also super important. And so P5.js is what we are using there. And P5.js has a website. It's P5JS.org. That's P5JS.org. See it right there? P5JS.org. We'll go back to that in just a little bit. As we start talking about how to use this in our projects. But for the time being, let's talk a little bit more about what this is, what it does, all that kind of fun stuff. So, before we get started here, I want to kind of talk about the fact that this is built on the Canvas HTML API. And so Canvas is an HTML framework API that we use to create graphics and draw on a website on the fly. So there actually is an HTML Canvas element. Your module tells you a little bit more about how to use these things manually. Right, they are a bit difficult to utilize manually, in my opinion. Right, they require a lot of tags, a lot of little bits of code. Right, if you've ever done anything with like Python with Turtle, for example, you know how like every single line has to do a little thing in order for it to be drawn on the screen, that sort of thing. And so we use the Canvas HTML5 element in conjunction with the JavaScript Canvas API to draw graphics onto websites, right? And we can do things like make simple applications, do various things with these items here. Several methods for, drawing paths, boxes, circles, text, and adding images. We won't really spend much time on Canvas itself here outside of just saying that it kind of exists in terms of what we're talking about in the live stream here. I encourage you all to make sure that you have a look at the material regarding HTML Canvas in the module. For our purposes, for what we're doing in this module is the fact that it is the backbone for P5.js. Right? So everything that P5.js does revolves around the canvas. Right? So in order to be able to do anything with P5.js, we will need a canvas. The P5.js framework takes advantage of that same Canvas JavaScript API. It just takes and it simplifies it, right? We've talked about frameworks in other classes and doing other things in the past, right? We take a framework or a library and, it's just code that other people have written that takes common tasks for us and simplifies them and allows us to utilize these more complicated things in a more simplified manner. Right? So we can take advantage of the code that other people have written for us and utilize it on a page. Right? So what exactly is P5.js? And P5.js, the definition or what P5.js is from the P5.js website, p5js.org, is that P5.js is a JavaScript library for creative coding with a focus on making coding accessible and inclusive for artists, designers, educators, beginners, and anyone else. Right? So again, that's kind of why I use it here, right? Is, this idea that, this is a knowingly sort of simplified library or framework. It's been designed for use for, multiple different types of people with different types of backgrounds who are, looking to get into code. Right, I had a friend of mine who hadn't really done a whole lot with code at the start. Right, before they got into it, they had been kind of interested in art. They'd primarily been interested in photography, and they wanted to get more into art, and they got into the idea of generative art. And generative art is basically art that's built upon algorithms, right? So I can use a computer-based algorithm to draw on a screen for me. So if you want to think about, like some of the more common ones, if you've seen things like, fractals that have been drawn, things of that nature. That's generative art. They use mathematical equations, different coding algorithms to be able to generate art onto a screen or a canvas. Right, so this individual, they had not really had much experience in coding, but they kind of got the bug, got interested in generative art. And the library that they were introduced to was P5.js. And all of a sudden, they got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, started learning more and more and more about it. And after a few years, they had started getting invited to speak at generative art conferences. And they also started to get, deeper into it. starting to, get interested in things like machine learning and things of that nature. So really, when we look at something like this that is very simple, it is something that can open the door for a lot of people. And even if it's very simple, it is still very powerful, and it is something that, allows us to do things quickly and easily, but it also allows us to, do things that are really, really cool. P5.js in particular is a JavaScript port of a programming language, or a programming library rather, called processing. And processing is a library that is available for many other programming languages. It's available for Java. It's available for Python. P5.js in particular is just one that is specifically for JavaScript that can run in the browser as a part of a website. And, of course, as we've already mentioned, it uses the HTML5 canvas to do that. Whereas, the ones for Java and Python would need some sort of GUI processing library also added on to that as well. P5.js has an excellent resource for references. And that's probably one of the best parts about this, right? One of the things that I said, as we were kind of kicking this off is, this is also a good opportunity for us to kind of learn how to utilize reference, because it's not something that we utilize a whole lot in general. We just kind of learn a skill and then we kind of just move on from there. But there's so many things that we can do here with P5.js that, being able to use a reference becomes super important. And the reference material that we find on p5js.org is really, really good. Because all of this stuff was developed by educators, right? Like this was, a lot of the references and things were developed with the purpose of education in mind, right? One of the big proponents of P5.js is one of my personal, if you will, programming heroes, Daniel Schiffman, who is or was, I'm unclear of his current status, a professor at NYU. A lot of work on this project has been done by people at NYU, and if we look at the Git for P5JS, which we could probably find that by just Googling it really quickly here, we could look at the commits and see the different contributors, and we could, if we looked, we could probably find, at least somewhere along the way, we might be able to find a commit from Dr. Schiffman. Although all of these are really recent, I don't know if he's done one very recently. So we might have to look for a while to find one from Schiffman. But, that's another thing that's great about this, is that this is open source as well. Lots of things that can be done with this here. We have the reference section here. We also have the example section here. Both of these sections will be vital to you all as you are kind of exploring this. The reference section tells you all of the functions. Once you click on a function here, it gives you an example about how to use the function. Some of the things here might look a little bit familiar to you all, right? Many of them should be a little bit familiar to you all. Right, and don't forget, the same thing kind of applies for when we talked about jQuery in the Web 140 course, that this is a library that's built on top of JavaScript, so we can still use JavaScript and things of that nature as well here. But, we can see a lot of pre-rendered functions, a lot of pre-written functions here. We'll use some of these examples. We see here a lot of the foundational functions here. We even see JSON here and how we can work with JSON in. So we have a stringify method that we can use here that will actually allow us to bring in JSON. To our P5JS projects. And looking through a lot of these functions, just kind of reading through them, we can see we have functions that deal with the camera. So if you want to deal with the user's webcam, you can deal with the user's webcam, which is kind of interesting. There's things here for audio and all sorts of different things here that you can work with and play with. Examples here. Looking at the examples page, you see examples of all sorts of stuff. Several games here, several interactive things. And you can look and kind of see how these individuals did it and how they worked it out, and maybe try to figure out how to modify what they've done, or even, use what they did to create something new. What we can see here, load saved JSON data. And look at here, based on Daniel Schiffman's load saved JSON data. But some of this should look familiar. There's a load JSON function. That load JSON function is in a preload. So, it's a little bit easier. And all it does is it does some interesting things here. So we use that reference as we're kind of progressing today. Now, as we're setting up our programming environment, we need two things. And I have a video that demonstrates this in the module as well. Right, one of the things that we need is we need to use the CDN, or we need the P5JS library file in order to be able to reference the functions that are used in the file. We need to actually have a reference to the file. I like to use the CDN to do that. So when we set up our project here in a minute, we'll set it up that way. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to put my P5JS code in its own special JavaScript file. So I can reserve my script.js file if I want one for just regular JavaScript for the website, and then a sketch.js file for my P5.js. So if I were to create a project, let me get my command prompt here. Go into my E drive, we'll cd into Web 215. We'll make a directory called P5JS 22. And we'll cd into P5JS 22. And then we'll run code period to open up VS Code in that folder. And yes, I trust the authors. And so from here I can create my index, index.html. We still need our index.html file. And I'm going to create sketch.js. Now in my index.html, I'm going to run exclamation point with Emmet to populate my HTML skeleton. We'll change the title to P5.js demo. And at the bottom of the head, we will put a link to the CDN for P5JS. So if we go on to p5js.org, you'll see there's a download link here on the left-hand side. If I click that, scroll down the page a little bit, you'll see I have 2 items here to where I can download the files, and one where I have a link to a CDN. This is the one I want to use. I can just click the copy script tag button here to copy the script tag for P5 and paste it at the bottom of my head, like so. I also want to put the reference for my sketch.js file at the bottom of my body, like I normally would any sort of JavaScript file that I'm creating that I'm going to run code in. So this is going to be script src equals sketch.js / script. Give that a save. And that's all we need to do to be able to sort of create our project here. Right, we have a project that's functional now, which is good. Right, so now what? Right, P5.js has 2 default functions that are required in every program. So we have to write 2 functions in every single program. These are a setup function and a draw function. And these 2 functions have different purposes. The setup function is used to form the foundation of what we're working on. So it's where we put the canvas, so we can establish a baseline canvas size, if we need to preload anything, if we need to do anything like that. Right, that's what we put in the setup function. Anything we basically need to set up our program, we put it in the setup function. The draw function, on the other hand, is special. In my master's degree program, I took a specialty in game and simulation development. Right, and a game developer might call what the draw function does a game loop. Right, essentially the draw function loops continuously. So it is basically an infinite loop. It is basically an infinite loop. That just keeps going over and over and over again with as forever until it's told to stop. So you actually have to tell it to stop. So we have these two functions. They're very special functions. And we can see them in action. And my next slide is my last slide that just says let's code a little bit. So let's just code a little bit. All right, so I'm going to switch over to my sketch.js file here. And I'm going to write my setup function. And I think I have to write it as a regular function, although I've never really tried writing it as an arrow notation function, so let's just try that. We'll try that. So I'm gonna start out by writing a function, and then we'll see it work, and then we'll switch it to test it. We'll switch it to test it to an arrow notation function just to see if it still works. And we'll add a setup and function. I'll have a function draw and function. So my setup function runs once. My draw function runs forever. So from here, I run my create canvas function. If we look in our P5JS documentation, our reference, let's look at width, let's look at height, and let's look at display width and display height and window width and window height. And then let's find canvas. It's in here somewhere. Yes, rendering. And nope, that's create graphics. I need create canvas. Where are you at? There you are. Create canvas. I was right. I was right on it and didn't even realize it. So create canvas. Create canvas is a function that goes in the setup function. We can see it here. It has two parameters that goes into it, a width and a height parameter. We can also put a background color into here, although we will move that background color when we start to work with our draw function. But how big our canvas is can be based on width and height. We can also base it on display width, display height, window width, window height. So window width and window height would be the ones that we would want, I believe, for our purpose here. right? Because display width and display height are for the entire display, whereas window width and window height are for the viewport. So if we want something that maps to the entire viewport, or that does, like, say, half the viewport, right, we can create canvas, window width, comma, window height. And really, that's all I need to do to create my canvas. It's going to do everything else for me. Now, if I run this with live server, we're not going to see anything here, right? Because we've just kind of created a blank canvas here. But if we look at inspect element here, we can see that we have a canvas in our code here. We've been given a main wrapper here, and inside of that main wrapper, there's a canvas that has the class of P5 canvas with a width of 1,879 pixels and a height of 970 pixels. Which is pretty good. Right, so that means that that canvas is there. We just have to give it a background color and it will show up. So let's give it a background color. And we can do that for our canvas by just adding right beneath it a background function reference and putting either 1 or 3 digits, 3 sets of numbers, I should say, into the background value here. So by default, 1 number gives me a shade of gray, and I can use, these are my RGB values. I can use anything here from 0 to 255. 0 being black, 255 being white. 52 here should be a dark gray. So if I look at this here now, I have a nice dark gray here. One of the things that you can see is that my canvas extends a little beyond the viewport. For my window width and my window height, if we subtract, say, 20 pixels there, that should give us an indication of what's going on there. Because now it fits pretty nicely, right? So that's probably going to have something to do with the margin, right? So ideally, probably what we'd want to do there is add a link to a CSS file. Link rel equals style sheet. href equals style.css. And then we can add a style.css to our project file and reset our margin to 0 and add a box sizing border box. And at that point, we should see that looks about right. And so if we took our 20 pixels off here and here, that should almost get us to where we're filling up the window. I believe it's adding in some for our URL bar at the top, maybe, or we can try to remove some padding as well. Let's get rid of padding here. Just to see what it does. We can go window height -20. We can see there, window height minus 20 is a little too much. Let's go window height minus 10. Window height minus 5. All right, I'd like to try to fill up the window here as much as possible. Which looks good. Now, if we resize this window now, right, it's not going to resize the canvas. But if we there is a way that we could use a resize function, but if we reloaded the page, it would give us the canvas at the right size. So there's some different things that we could do here to do that. But, you know, that's one of the interesting things that we could do. So now, let's just put something on our screen. Right, we've got our canvas represented here on our screen. Right, actually, I said I was going to test out the arrow notation here. So let's test out that. We'll see if that works. And it doesn't. It probably uses this dot. It probably uses this keyword in the library would be my guess. Which, you know, as we've discussed in the past, this keyword works differently with arrow notation functions than it does with regular functions like this. But now we can start to draw something. And so we can put our drawing here in our draw function. And so let's just start to draw by creating a rectangle. And so I'm going to start this off with a fill color, right? And that's going to be the fill color for my rectangle. It might try to give you a different function because it doesn't know the fill function. You just need to click off somewhere, click back, do that. And let's go 0, 255, 255. Right, and this is not a function. Or it is a function, it's just a predefined function. It's not one that I'm writing. So I got a fill function here. I don't want my square to have an outline around it. So I'm going to put no stroke here. And now I'm going to add my square to the canvas. And so all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are necessarily squares. So we use a rectangle function, rect, and we might have to click off and click back for this, to be able to make a rectangle. And so if we look at our documentation, we can find our rectangle. Shape, 2D primitives, rectangle. we see we have our rectangle function. Our rectangle function has 4 our basic rectangle function has 4. You can see that we can add more that'll give our corners a rounded radius. But our basic rectangle function has 4 parameters. There's an x location, a y location, a width, and a height. So let's create a variable here. Var SQ equals 100. Let's say. Right, so this way I have a singular value that I can change and change the size of my square. Right, so my x location is going to be, I'm going to want to start it out in the middle of my canvas. So we can actually use relative locations, window width, window height. Window width divided by 2 minus SQ divided by 2. We'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. Comma, window height divided by 2 minus SQ divided by 2, comma, SQ, comma, SQ. Both of those are the same as SQ because it's a square, so both sides are equal. Right? If I wanted to make it a rectangle with some different sides, I can make those values different. Right, but now, if I change these values, and I want to make my square bigger or smaller, I just change that one value there. And it changes the relative positioning in response to the width and the height. And the size of the square as well. So we can look at our canvas now. And where are we at? I actually do know what happened here, but I want to look here. I want to just kind of call this out. Right, so what's happened here is this background, actually. I'm going to move it down and I'm going to move it into my draw function. With that background in my setup function, it's actually covering up what's going on in my draw function. So it seems kind of counterintuitive. Well, that's actually where it should be there, but let's figure out what's gone wrong here. Fill, no stroke. Let's get rid of no stroke. I know that's not the issue. Let's get rid of these guys, even though those shouldn't be the issue. Just try to place him somewhere. Let's just see if we can get him on here. The background should be in the draw function here. We'll just see why this is causing problems. Because that should be all I need to do. be able to have this square show up on screen. If all else fails, one of the things you can try is you can try to go into the P5 web editor, copy your code, and paste it in there. And some of the things that you might find that you might not find in your regular Visual Studio, you might find, because it's more geared toward them. And so we have some stuff here. P5 had problems creating the global function SQ. Is SQ a global variable? That's possible. That would be something that I would not have expected. I guess SQ is a global variable. SQ is a reserved keyword that's already in there. So let's change that to SQA. So that helps me out. So you can see that puts the square in the middle of my screen for me. In the P5JS module here, in the P5JS module here, I do this ball bounce. And so before we go, what I'd like to do is I'd like to, and it'd be technically this ball bounce. Before we go, what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of take this ball bounce and kind of do it to the next level by using an object to make a bunch of balls. Basically, just so you can see how all of that works. And so I'm going to kind of move pretty quickly here so you can see this. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a class. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called balls. And I'm going to set that equal to an empty array. Right, because what we're going to do is we're going to use a function to create multiple objects using an object function. And then we're going to push the results of that object function to this array. So we're going to have an array of objects. Then we're just going to have them bounce all around our screen. And that'll kind of be where we go to kind of wrap this up. So in this, we'll create a class of ball with a curly brace. And in P5JS, we use a constructor. So we make this object using a constructor. So this would be similar to how we would build the objects in Java, for example. But we're going to pass this constructor 3 parameters, an X parameter, a Y parameter, and a diameter parameter. We'll call that DIA. just like we were doing with our objects last couple of weeks, with our object function. We'll make a this.x and set that equal to whatever we bring in as our x parameter. A this.y, and we'll bring it into as our y parameter. A this.dia, and we'll set that equal to our dia parameter. And then we will give it a bit of randomness, right? So we will give it a this.xdir, or a this.x direction. And we will give that a random number for an x direction. Now, luckily, P5.js has a random function in it, so I don't have to go math.floor, math.random, blah, blah, blah. Right? I can just do random and give it two parameters for the low number and the high number. So I'm going to go 1 to 5. So I want a random number between 1 and 5. This dot y direction equals random 1 to 5. So it'll give me a random number between 1 and 5 for the y direction as well. And then I want to make each ball a special color. So this dot r equals random 0 to 255. We'll do that again for G. This dot G equals random 0 to 255. This dot B equals random 0 to 255. And so also as a part of this object, I'm going to have some functions for this object, which is another thing that we can do for our objects. And I'm going to have a move function. And so when ball.move, it's going to do some certain things. And it's the same thing that I do in the video. I'm just doing it as an object this time. So it's this dot x plus equals the direction, which, I mean, that really means that it's, it's not a direction so much as it is this dot y as it is a speed, right? This dot y plus equals this dot y dir. And then basically we have this other bit of code here that I'll just copy it and paste it from my notes here to where if it hits a wall, it will bounce back and change direction and go back the other way, right? So that's what we're doing here. Basically, if the x location is less than that or this or that, right. Again, this is basically just the same thing as that video. Just for the sake of time, I'm kind of rushing through it here. This is just done in an object instead of being done on its own. So if you want, you know, the detailed explanation of that, watch the ball bounce video in the module. So let's also do a function that will display our ball. And that'll basically do the same thing that we just did here, just here. So we have a fill that gives us our random red, green, and blue values, no stroke. And there that is. And so this is our ball object. So now each ball that we create is going to get an X location, it's going to get a Y location, it's going to get a diameter, it's going to get a random X and Y speed, and it's going to get a random RGB value for a color. So each object we make is going to get different properties for each of these. It's going to make a different ball that has each of these properties that are going to be different. And each of these balls are going to be moving at their own pace in their own way. And we need to be able to display each of the balls as well. So in our setup function, we will write a little for loop that creates as many balls as we want. So let's go into our setup function here. And let's write a little for loop for var I equals 0. I is less than, let's say 20. Let's make 20 balls. I plus plus. What we want to do is we want to push to our balls array a new instance of this ball object each time through this function. So we'd have 20 different objects in this array at the end of the day. Right? So balls dot push, right? Because we're pushing this object into the balls function, or the balls array, which is balls here. We're going to be pushing a new ball object with the following parameters. We'll give it a random size. So, you know, we give it an X value, a Y value. So we could start it at a random X location between, let's say, 100 and window width minus 100. We'll give it a random Y location to start at between, say, 100 and window height minus 100. And we will give it a random size between, let's say, 40 and 90. So now that creates us an array of objects with all of these properties. All we would have to do in our draw function then would be to call these functions, call the display function and the move function for each of the objects that had been created in this object array. So for let ball of balls ball dot display, right? We lowercase d displayed. Ball dot display ball dot move. So if we look at our live site now, something's a little weird. Let's see if we can figure out where we went wrong. W is not defined. Oh, that was in something that I copied and pasted. That was in something that I copied and pasted, trying to be in a hurry. Window width. Window height. And there they are. Let's refresh them with the full size here. And so there are our balls. We have 20 different objects there, all different sizes, moving at different speeds, all different colors, moving around the window. And one of the interesting things that we can do as well, like if we wanted to take this and make it a little bit interactive, we could attach this square to our mouse. So the rectangle X and Y location, instead of being that and that, we can use from our documentation mouse X and mouse Y. Because that takes the X location of the mouse and the Y location of the mouse. So it would basically just attach that rectangle to the mouse. So now I have that rectangle attached to the mouse. So it's a little bit interactive. If I wanted to a little bit, right, I could add a little bit of code in here. We won't do it for the sake of time, right, because we're already over an hour. But we could basically add a little bit of code to the move function here that could basically repel the random balls from the square as they're moving around. So you'd basically just change their direction if they got into the area of the square here. That could be done as well, right? Which would just make this even more interesting. And so that's all that I have for you for today. I know that was a lot, and we kind of moved through it relatively quickly. But again, a big thing that I want you all to kind of get out of this is to be able to try to consult the reference material, be able to use your reference tools, be able to use different things out of this one. You know, this is a relatively simple framework, a relatively simple library, so it should be a relatively simple reference library for us to use. And so that's where we'll go from here. So if anybody who's here with me live has any questions, I'll hang out in the chat for a few minutes with the music playing just to answer questions if anybody has questions. But that's all that I have for you for today. I may post another video. I might wait and post it a little bit later because it might go along a little bit better with your final project, because it would, to some degree, meet a goal of the final project. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
the win!